Please welcome Israel's Consul General for the Southwestern United States, David Siegel.
Good afternoon. I'm last but not least. I don't know how you overcome all the wonderful speakers that were here before me. And by the way, I apologize for my heavy Israeli accent. I haven't been an athlete since I was 17 in religious school in Haifa. You know, I do represent the state of Israel in 7 states in the Southwest, and I do it, I hope, with a lot of passion and vigor. But it all begins many, many years ago in the late 60s when my family made Aliyah to Haifa. And my dad was a conservative rabbi, one of the founding members of the Masorti movement in Israel. Thank you very much. In fact, the term Masorti was his term, and there was a big fight over the years about what to call the movement in Israel. So, you know, there are all sorts of minorities in Israel, and I grew up in a small group of conservative Jews in Haifa. Of course, my dad, with his infinite wisdom, sent me to an all-boy Orthodox yeshiva. So I sort of grew up with all streams of Judaism in my life. And when I think about the way people, especially in this country, but around the world, relate to Israel today, I always think back to an old experience going back to the days when I was a preteen. And I remember going from Israel to the United States and going from my religious world through my conservative, semi-religious world to my totally secular extended family in the United States, and trying to make that conversation make sense in my mind. Those who were against circumcision or the bris, those who saw my relatives in America as almost non-Jews, and this whole cacophony of voices in the Jewish world that I was already exposed to as a young child. And I think of it today, the way we relate to Israel, and I see the same challenge. Everybody's got a truth. Everyone has a complete utopic truth of what Israel should be, whether it's on the right or on the left. But Israel is so much more complicated than just a utopia. You know, even in Disney movies, my kids will tell you, there's always a bad guy, and there's not always a happy ending. And things actually tend to get difficult even in Disney movies and even in fairy tales. So my approach to Israel is to try to educate and to try to enrich and bring about those old conversations from when I was a child, just to be a bit more successful at it. So what is missing in the conversation about Israel today? If we're all looking at Israel through political eyes, I believe we're missing a very important experience. It's simply that. It's the experience of when you get off the plane in Israel, and leave the airport, get on the highway, whether you're going to Tel Aviv or going to Jerusalem, and you experience that personal, almost familial, intimate connection to the land and to the people. And this is something that I think we're missing in the conversation, because when we only go to the headlines, when we only go to the stories of crisis, what I call the ticker tape of crisis, we just miss out. We miss out on everything else that is happening in Israel today and the connections and the meaning that we derive from one another. For example, let's talk about Israel's civil society. You heard a little bit about the social protests last summer that were a very, very significant moment in our history. There are 17,000 NGOs in Israel. 17,000, employing 500,000 people. They're not government, they're not private sector, they're something else. That's 17,000 reasons and opportunities to connect to an Israel that fits your personal point of view. It's a wonderful part of Israel's reality that I find people don't pay enough attention to. Just one little example. Before I came here as Consul General this summer, we tried to see some of the civil action organizations in Israel before I came, and we went to one small organization you may have heard called Save a Child's Heart. Thank you. We're going to bring Save a Child's Heart to Los Angeles in late April, and we're actually looking for allies in exposing them to the community. Save a Child's Heart is 10 years old, started by an American who made Aliyah, Dr. Ami Cohen. It's a tiny NGO in Wolfson Hospital in southern Tel Aviv, or in Holon, actually. And this NGO has performed over 3,000 open-heart surgeries on children from around the world that need that medical care and don't have it in the countries they come from. 1 out of every 10 children in the world has a heart deformity that can easily be fixed if it's treated early enough in life. It gets more and more complicated as children grow up into adults. So in Tel Aviv, they performed 3,000 open-heart surgeries in the last 10 years. They also train physicians from Africa. Today, 50% of the patients are from the Palestinian territories, both the West Bank and Gaza. It's very, very significant. And every Tuesday is what they call Palestine Clinic Day, where you walk into a room, and it's a large waiting room, and you have families, mainly from Gaza, in full Islamic garb, sitting, waiting for treatment for children either before surgery or after surgery. Some of them are already tall teenagers that have been coming back for treatment over the years. This is an Israel that we simply don't know enough about. I, as a diplomat for Israel, didn't know enough about. Without that personal experience, it's very, very hard to know about it, to be exposed to it, and certainly to share it with others. When we say that Israel does humanitarian work at home and overseas, and just looking at the last year, it's really been an incredible set of examples. Israelis went to Japan and set up a hospital in the heart of the nuclear epicenter during the earthquake and after the earthquake in Japan. Israelis are still there. I don't need to tell you that Israelis went to Haiti a few years ago, were the first on the ground with the Americans, despite traveling from the other side of the world in 2 El Al flights without knowing if the planes could land, set up the first military hospital, the first Ethiopian trained surgeon, pediatric surgeon in Israel was on the first flight, a member of 240 medical personnel that came off the plane, stayed on the ground in Haiti, and saved thousands of lives in those first chaotic weeks until the Americans took over. Israelis are still in Haiti today. Thank you. Israelis are also in Turkey after the earthquake there last year. IsraAid, which is a little-known Israeli NGO, thank you, one of the 17,000, is operating in Mexico right now, post-earthquake, and is in countless countries around the world. The new country of southern Sudan is benefiting from Israeli assistance on the ground. Thailand and floods. There are dozens and dozens of countries where IsraAid, Israel Flying Aid, another NGO that specializes in going into closed societies that Israel does not have diplomatic relations with, yet still saving lives on the ground, operate all the time. We should know about this. It's a part of Israel that is significant. Now, you'll hear about Iran, you'll hear about the conflict. In fact, that part of the portfolio, I would argue, is overexposed, so I'll leave it to others to discuss that. I want to talk about the Israel that I think is significant to share with you. High tech. So this is an amazing story. Anybody have the iPad 3 yet? Do you know? I sound like the grandfather in my fat Greek wedding movie, but Apple just purchased Innobit, which is a startup company in Tel Aviv, and Apple is now setting up an R&D center both in Herzliya and in Haifa for the first time outside of California, and the graphics in the iPad 3 are basically from the flash drive technology of Innobit. Thank you. 2 weeks ago, we had 1 million Israelis in bomb shelters in Israel's south. Yet Intel, one of its R&D centers, is in Kiryat Gat, not that far from my home in the mountains of Jerusalem. And Intel just announced an upgrade of $3 billion to the southern plant, which is within the rocket fire range from Gaza. And this is one of the plants responsible for 40% of Intel's profits today. And this is all happening in Israel. And I could go on and on. You know the story, but the high-tech side of Israel is becoming very, very significant. The innovation in Israel Israel is becoming one of the innovation centers of the world. And in today's world, when everyone is addicted to innovation, that is significant. Now, we can talk about crisis, or we can talk about opportunity, or we can talk about both. Today, in Israel, the chancellor of UCI Irvine, Michael Drake, is signing agreements with 4 universities throughout the country. He'll be meeting with President Peres tomorrow. We can choose to treat campuses as crises, or we could choose to treat campuses as opportunities. Here is one example of a university that was in crisis that is on its way to becoming an incredible opportunity. Thank you. Judaism. There are all these complaints and worries and anxiety about what is happening in Israel with Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox and women. I can tell you, growing up in this epicenter of the pluralism battle in Israel, we have come a very long way. 40,000 Israelis today study in pluralistic school programs. The Schechter Center in Jerusalem, almost $10 million, a new campus teaching pluralism in Israel. The Haredi community that is going through transition and change. Knesset member Amsalem from Shas, who broke away from the party, who started an organization called One People, Am Echad, with a vision of uniting the world's Jewish communities. All of these exciting things are happening in Israel. And all of them are invitations to you to come and join the 17,000 NGOs or political groups or community-based organizations, whether it's the Rogozin Bialik School in Tel Aviv, teaching immigrant children from 48 countries, or Ayalim in the south, or Kishurit in the north, or Save a Child's Heart in Tel Aviv. They all have internships. The Hartman Center in Jerusalem just announced a new internship program. There are so many opportunities, in fact, 17,000 opportunities, to connect to those parts of Israel that may be very, very exciting to you. Now, no country is perfect, and I'm not here to tell you that Israel doesn't have problems and foibles and challenges and injustices. Far from it. We're not a city on the hill, but we're certainly not the country with the sinking ship analogy either. We are a normal country in an extraordinary situation. In the Middle East, 70 to 100 different ethnic groups, 70 different languages, all trying to make this work. And this is a significant experience for Jews in Israel, for Jews around the world, and for non-Jewish citizens of Israel, which I am very proud to represent to you in this country. So I hope to continue this conversation with you, and I hope that we're able to enrich the conversation beyond just crisis or paradise and make Israel an authentic experience for everyone. Thank you very, very much.